Jake Murphy knew something was wrong when the ship started shaking like a leaf in a storm. The control panels in front of him flashed red and yellow warnings that made his heart race faster than he wanted to admit. He had been exploring space for 3 years now, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The Starbound was his pride and joy. It was not the biggest ship in the human fleet, but it was fast and reliable. Jake had taken it to dozens of star systems without any major problems. Today was supposed to be just another routine mission to check out a new system that the long-range scanners had found last month. The engine made a grinding noise that sent chills down Jake's spine. He pressed buttons and pulled levers trying to fix whatever was going wrong, but nothing worked. The ship's computer kept repeating the same message over and over: engine failure imminent. Recommend immediate evacuation. Engine failure imminent. Jake looked out the front window and saw a planet getting bigger and bigger. It was brown and red with patches of green scattered across its surface. 2 small moons hung in the dark sky like pale eyes watching him fall towards certain death. The planet had an atmosphere which was good news. The bad news was that his ship was falling apart around him. Pieces of the hull started breaking away from the main body of the Starbound. Jake watched in horror as parts of his ship burned up in the atmosphere like shooting stars. The heat shields were failing, and the temperature inside the cabin was rising fast. Sweat poured down his face as he struggled to reach the emergency escape pod. The escape pod was located in the back section of the ship. Jake had to crawl through twisted metal and sparkling wires to reach it. Smoke filled his lungs and made his eyes water. The ship groaned and screamed as it fell through the alien sky. Jake knew he only had minutes before the whole thing exploded. He finally reached the escape pod and threw himself inside. His hands shook as he strapped himself into the safety harness. The pod was small and cramped with just enough room for 1 person and some basic supplies. Jake hit the launch button and felt his stomach drop as the pod shot away from the dying ship. Through the small window, Jake watched the Starbound break into 1,000 pieces. Orange and red flames consumed what was left of his home for the past 3 years. All his personal belongings and research data were gone forever. The only thing that mattered now was surviving the landing. The escape pod had its own heat shield and parachute system, but Jake had never tested it in real conditions. The pod spun and tumbled as it fell toward the planet's surface. Jake felt sick and dizzy, but he forced himself to stay conscious. He needed to be awake when he landed, in case. There were hostile creatures waiting for him. The parachute deployed with a loud pop that made Jake's ears ring. The pod slowed down, but it was still falling fast. Jake could see the ground rushing up to meet him. It looked like a desert with red rocks and strange purple plants growing between them. In the distance, he could see what looked like buildings, or structures of some kind. The pod hit the ground with a crash that rattled Jake's teeth. He tasted blood in his mouth and felt a sharp pain in his left shoulder. The harness had saved his life, but it had also bruised his chest and arms. Jake took deep breaths and tried to calm his racing heart. He was alive, and that was all that mattered for now. Jake unstrapped himself and checked his body for serious injuries. His shoulder hurt, but it was not broken. He had cuts on his hands from the sharp metal inside the ship, but nothing that would not heal. The emergency supplies in the pod included a first aid kit, and Jake used it to clean his wounds. The pod had landed in a small crater that it had made when it hit the ground. Jake climbed out carefully and looked around at his new surroundings. The air was thin but breathable. The gravity felt a little lighter than Earth, which made each step feel strange and bouncy. The red sun in the sky was smaller than Earth's sun, but it still provided warmth and light. Jake activated the emergency beacon in his survival kit. It would send a signal to any human ships that came looking for him. The signal was not very strong, and it would take time for help to arrive if it came at all. Jake knew he might be stuck on this planet for months or even years. The structures he had seen from the air were about 2 miles away across the rocky desert. Jake decided to head toward them since staying near the crash site would not help him survive. He gathered his supplies, which included water purification tablets, energy bars, a small medical kit, and a multi-tool that could be used as a knife or screwdriver. As Jake walked across the alien landscape, he wondered what kind of creatures lived in those distant buildings. He hoped they were friendly or at least not interested in eating humans. The purple plants around him looked harmless, but Jake was careful not to touch them. Many alien plants were poisonous to humans even if they looked safe. The walk took longer than expected because Jake had to rest several times. The thin air made him tired faster than normal, and the strange gravity affected his balance. The red rocks under his feet were sharp and made walking difficult. Jake was grateful for his sturdy boots, which protected his feet from the worst of it. As the day grew longer, Jake could see more details about the structures ahead. They were definitely buildings made by intelligent creatures. The walls were smooth and curved in ways that human architecture rarely used. Jake felt both excited and nervous about meeting whatever species had built this place. When Jake finally reached the edge of the settlement, he could see creatures moving around between the buildings. They were tall and covered in what looked like natural armor. Jake took a deep breath and walked forward, hoping these aliens would help him instead of killing him. His adventure on this strange world was just beginning. The creatures that found Jake were unlike anything he had ever seen before. They stood nearly 8 feet tall with thick, scaly skin that looked like natural armor plating. Their heads were long and narrow like a crocodile, but they walked upright, on 2 powerful legs. Yellow eyes studied Jake with the same curiosity that humans might show when looking at a strange insect. The largest of these aliens stepped forward and made sounds that Jake could not understand. The creature wore what appeared to be some kind of leader's clothing with bright colors and metal decorations. After a few minutes of failed communication, one of the aliens brought a small device that began translating their words into English. War. Chief Zraktar was the name of their leader, and he seemed amused by Jake's appearance. The alien laughed when he saw how small Jake was compared to his own people. Zraktar poked Jake with one clawed finger, as if testing whether the human was real or just some kind of illusion. These aliens called themselves the Cathari, and they had built their entire society around physical strength and combat prowess. The strongest warriors became leaders while the weak were forced to serve or were cast out entirely. They had never encountered a species as physically small and apparently fragile as humans. Jake tried to explain that he was an explorer from Earth and that his people would eventually come looking for him. The Cathari found this claim hilarious, since they could not imagine how such weak creatures could have developed space travel. Zraktar suggested that perhaps Jake's species had been given technology by stronger aliens who took pity on them. The Cathari decided to keep Jake as a curiosity rather than killing him outright. They built him a small shelter on the edge of their settlement where he would be safe but could not interfere with their daily activities. Jake was grateful to be alive, but frustrated by their attitude toward him and his entire species. Days passed, and Jake became a regular source of entertainment for the Cathari. Young warriors would gather around his shelter to watch him eat or sleep or perform basic tasks. They found it amusing how carefully Jake moved and how he seemed to avoid any activity that might cause injury or pain. The Cathari practiced their combat skills in an open area near Jake's shelter. They used weapons that were far too heavy for a human to lift and performed fighting moves that would have broken Jake's bones if he tried to copy them. The young warriors often made exaggerated gestures of weakness and fragility to mock what they saw as typical human behavior. Jake observed their society carefully during these long days of captivity. The Cathari respected only displays of raw power and physical dominance. They viewed compassion and mercy as serious character flaws that made individuals unfit for survival. Any Cathari who showed kindness to the weak was often challenged to combat by stronger members of their community. Their champion was a massive warrior named Mordak, the Unbreakable, who had never lost a single combat challenge. He stood nearly 9 feet tall, and his natural armor was thicker and darker than the other Cathari. Mordak ruled through fear and intimidation, making even the bravest warriors nervous when he was nearby. Jake watched Mordak train each morning with weapons that weighed more than Jake's entire body. The champion could break thick stones with his bare hands and bend metal bars like they were made of soft clay. All the other Cathari treated Mordak with a mixture of respect and terror that Jake found disturbing. One day, Jake witnessed a young Cathari child fall and injure its leg while playing near the combat training area. The child cried in pain, but the adult Cathari ignored it completely. In their culture, showing concern for the injured was seen as a sign of weakness that could lead to social punishment. Jake could not stand to watch the child suffer, so he approached carefully with his basic first aid supplies. The child was frightened of Jake at first, but allowed him to clean and bandage the wound. Jake used gentle movements and spoke in soft tones to keep the young Cathari calm during the treatment. The adult Cathari were amazed by Jake's behavior. They could not understand why he would waste time and resources helping someone who was clearly too weak to deserve assistance. This act of kindness only reinforced their belief that humans were soft-hearted creatures who could never survive in a harsh universe. Elder Vexisha was the oldest and wisest member of the settlement, and she became curious about Jake's species after watching him help the injured child. She began asking Jake questions about human civilization and technology through the translation device. Jake told her about human cities and schools and hospitals and scientific achievements. Vexisha was impressed by human ingenuity and creativity, but she still viewed humans as physically inferior to almost every other species in the galaxy. She wondered aloud how such fragile beings had managed to develop advanced technology without being conquered or enslaved by stronger races. The mockery continued as Jake struggled with tasks that were simple for the Cathari. He could not lift their heavy tools or endure their planet's extreme temperature changes without discomfort. The aliens began calling him Soft Skin the Weak and treated his presence like a form of daily entertainment. Jake tried to demonstrate human skills that did not require great physical strength. He showed them how to tie complex knots and how to start fires using basic materials. The Cathari were mildly interested in these techniques, but they did not consider them impressive, since they did not involve combat or displays of raw power. The situation became more difficult when some Cathari suggested that Jake should be forced to fight for his food and shelter like any other member of their society. They argued that keeping him as a pet was beneath their dignity as a warrior culture. Jake knew that any combat challenge would likely result in his death. Zraktar protected Jake from these suggestions because he enjoyed having such an unusual creature in his settlement. Other war chiefs from neighboring areas had heard about the strange human, and they visited regularly to see Jake for themselves. This attention increased Zraktar's status among his peers. Jake used this time to learn more about Cathari culture and language. He studied their fighting techniques and weapons, even though he could never hope to match their physical abilities. Jake also observed their weaknesses and blind spots that came from relying too heavily on brute force. The Cathari had little interest in strategy or tactics, since they believed that superior strength would always overcome clever planning. They fought in predictable patterns and often left themselves vulnerable while attempting to land devastating attacks. Jake filed this information away, hoping he would never need to use it. As days turned into weeks, Jake began to feel like a zoo animal, being displayed for the amusement of visitors. He maintained his dignity and tried to learn as much as possible about his captors, but the constant mockery was wearing down his spirits. Jake wondered if rescue would ever come, or if he would spend the rest of his life as the Cathari's pet human. The morning started like any other day in the Cathari settlement. Jake woke up in his small shelter and prepared for another day of being stared at and mocked by the alien warriors. He had grown used to their routine and had learned to ignore most of their taunts and crude jokes about human weakness. Jake was eating his morning meal when he heard loud shouting from the central area of the settlement. Through the gaps in his shelter walls, he could see a crowd gathering around something that was happening near the food preparation area. Jake moved closer to get a better look at what was causing all the excitement. A smaller Cathari named HFY had accidentally knocked over a container of fermented drink while serving the morning meal. The purple liquid had splashed across the ground near where Mordak the Unbreakable usually sat to eat. The massive champion had not been there when the accident happened, but he arrived just as HFY was trying to clean up the mess. Mordak's reaction was swift and brutal. He grabbed HFY by the throat and lifted the smaller alien off the ground with one powerful hand. Mordak's yellow eyes blazed with rage as he accused HFY of deliberately insulting him by making a mess near his eating area. The smaller Cathari tried to explain that it was an accident, but Mordak was beyond listening to reason. The champion threw HFY to the ground and began kicking him with his armored feet. Each blow made a sickening sound as it connected with HFY's ribs and back. The smaller alien tried to crawl away, but Mordak followed him step by step, continuing the savage beating. The other Cathari watched this display without any sign of concern or sympathy. In their culture, the strong had the right to punish the weak for any reason they chose. HFY had made a mistake, and now he would pay the price for his clumsiness. No one would dare interfere with Mordak's punishment. Jake watched in horror as the beating continued. HFY was barely conscious now, and blood was flowing from several wounds on his head and body. Mordak showed no signs of stopping his assault, and Jake realized that the smaller alien might be beaten to death over something as minor as spilled drink. Something inside Jake snapped as he watched this senseless violence. He had been raised to believe that protecting the weak was a basic moral duty. Jake could not stand by and watch an innocent creature be murdered over such a trivial accident. Without thinking about the consequences, Jake ran toward the center of the settlement. "Stop!" Jake shouted at the top of his voice as he pushed through the crowd of watching Cathari. "Leave him alone!" He did not mean to spill anything. It was just an accident. Jake placed himself between Mordak and the injured HFY, even though he knew it was probably a death sentence. The entire settlement fell silent, as if someone had suddenly turned off all sound in the universe. Every Cathari stared at Jake with expressions of complete shock and disbelief. No one had ever dared to interfere with Mordak's punishments before, especially not a weak alien who should have been grateful just to be allowed to live. Mordak stopped his attack and turned slowly to face Jake. The champion's eyes narrowed as he processed what had just happened. A creature barely half his size had just given him a direct command and placed itself between him and his victim. The implications of this act were so outrageous that Mordak needed a moment to fully understand them. "What did you say?" Mordak asked, in a voice that was barely above a whisper. His massive hands clenched into fists as rage began building inside him like lava in a volcano. No creature in the history of the settlement had ever spoken to him with such disrespect, and lived to tell about it. Jake knew there was no backing down now. "I said stop," Jake repeated more loudly so that everyone in the settlement could hear him clearly. "You are beating an innocent person over nothing. This is wrong, and I will not let you continue." Jake's voice shook slightly, but he forced himself to stand straight and meet Mordak's furious gaze. The champion's roar of rage echoed across the entire settlement and probably carried to the neighboring communities as well. Mordak had never experienced such complete and total disrespect in his entire life. His status as the undefeated champion meant that every creature on the planet should bow before him in fear and submission. "How dare you speak to me like that?" Mordak snarled as he took a step toward Jake. "You are nothing but a weak, pathetic creature that we keep alive for our amusement. You have no right to question my actions or interfere with my justice. I should kill you right now for your insolence." War Chief Zraktar pushed through the crowd to see what was causing such a disturbance. When he saw Jake standing defiantly in front of the enraged champion, his own expression became one of amazement mixed with concern. Zraktar had grown somewhat fond of his pet human and did not want to see Jake killed over something foolish. "The challenge has been made," Mordak announced loudly so that everyone could hear his words. "This creature has questioned my authority and interfered with my punishment of the weak. According to our most sacred laws, he must face me in ritual combat to settle this dispute. There can be no other outcome." Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized what was happening. He had heard about ritual combat during his time with the Cathari, but he had never imagined he would be forced to participate in one. Ritual combat was a fight to the death or submission between two individuals with no weapons allowed except natural abilities. Zraktar stepped forward and spoke in formal tones that made the challenge official according to Cathari law. "The human Jake Murphy has interfered with the champion's justice and questioned his authority. Mordak the Unbreakable has issued a formal challenge for ritual combat. Jake Murphy must accept this challenge or be executed immediately for cowardice." Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him. Every Cathari was watching him with expressions ranging from amusement to excitement. They were all eager to see their mighty champion crush the presumptuous human who had dared to question their way of life. No one expected this fight to last more than a few seconds. "I accept the challenge," Jake said quietly, but his words carried clearly in the silence. He had no choice, and everyone knew it. Refusing would mean immediate death, while accepting gave him at least a tiny chance of survival. Jake had never backed down from a fight in his life, and he was not going to start now. The crowd erupted in cheers and excited chatter as word of the challenge spread throughout the settlement. Cathari began placing bets on how quickly Mordak would defeat the human. Most believed it would be over before Jake could even attempt to defend himself. "The combat will take place at sunset in the sacred arena," Zraktar announced formally. "Both fighters will enter the circle, and only one will leave victorious. May the strongest warrior prove his worth before all who witness this battle." Jake spent the rest of the day preparing himself mentally and physically for what was almost certainly going to be his death. He had no illusions about his chances against a creature twice his size with natural armor and a lifetime of combat training. But Jake had one advantage that the Cathari did not know about. He was human, and humans had survived for thousands of years by being smarter and more adaptable than their stronger enemies. The sun was setting behind the Red Mountains when Jake walked toward the sacred combat arena. His legs felt weak and his hands were shaking, but he forced himself to move forward with as much dignity as he could manage. Behind him he could hear the excited voices of hundreds of Cathari who had come from neighboring settlements to watch the spectacle. The arena was a perfect circle carved into the rocky ground with raised seating areas for spectators on all sides. Ancient symbols were etched into the stone walls telling the history of great champions who had fought and died in this sacred place. Jake tried not to think about how many warriors had bled and died on the sand beneath his feet. Mordak was already waiting in the center of the arena. The massive champion looked even more intimidating under the flickering torchlight that illuminated the fighting circle. His natural armor plates gleamed like polished metal, and his muscles rippled beneath his scaly skin as he stretched and prepared for combat. The crowd roared with approval when they saw their champion. Mordak raised his arms above his head and flexed his massive biceps for the cheering spectators. He was clearly enjoying the attention and the opportunity to demonstrate his superiority over the presumptuous human who had dared to challenge him. Jake entered the arena from the opposite side, and the crowd immediately began laughing and making jokes about his small size. Next to Mordak, he looked like a child who had wandered into an adult fighting tournament by mistake. Several Cathari called out suggestions for how the champion should kill the human most entertainingly. War Chief. Zraktar stood up in the ceremonial viewing box and raised his hands for silence. By the ancient laws of our people, these two warriors will settle their dispute through combat. No weapons are permitted except the natural abilities granted by birth and training. The fight continues until one warrior submits or dies. Jake tried to calm his racing heart as he studied his opponent more carefully. Mordak was incredibly strong, and his armor plating would protect him from most attacks that Jake could deliver. The champion also had reach advantage with arms that were nearly twice as long as Jake's. In a straight fight, Jake would lose within seconds. But Jake had advantages that the Cathari could not see or understand. Human beings had evolved as persistence hunters who used intelligence and endurance to bring down prey much larger than themselves. Jake had also trained in mixed martial arts during his military service, and he understood leverage and pressure points better than these aliens realized. The fight began when Zraktar dropped a ceremonial flag to signal the start of combat. Mordak immediately charged forward with his arms spread wide, intending to grab Jake and crush him like a bug. The champion's strategy was simple and brutal. End the fight as quickly as possible with overwhelming force. Jake had been expecting this kind of attack. He waited until the last possible second, then dropped low and rolled to his right, avoiding Mordak's grasping claws by inches. The champion's momentum carried him several steps past where Jake had been standing. The crowd gasped in surprise at the human's unexpected speed and agility. Mordak spun around quickly and launched another attack. This time he swung his massive fist in a wide arc that would have taken Jake's head off if it had connected. Jake ducked under the punch and moved to Mordak's left side, where the champion could not easily reach him with his other hand. The human struck out with a quick jab to Mordak's ribs just below his armor plating. The punch would not have hurt a Cathari very much under normal circumstances, but Jake had aimed for a nerve cluster that he had observed during his weeks of watching their anatomy. Mordak grunted in surprise and took a step backward. The crowd fell silent as they realized that the human had actually managed to land a blow on their supposedly invincible champion. This was not supposed to happen. Mordak should have ended the fight already, but instead he was backing away from his much smaller opponent. Jake did not give the champion time to recover from his surprise. He moved forward quickly and delivered a series of rapid strikes to pressure points along Mordak's arms and shoulders. Each blow was precisely aimed at spots where Cathari anatomy was most vulnerable. Jake had studied their species carefully during his captivity. Mordak roared in frustration and swung both arms in a wide, sweeping motion, trying to catch Jake in a bear hug that would crush his ribs. Jake saw the attack coming and dropped to the ground, then swept his leg in a circle that caught both of Mordak's ankles. The massive champion stumbled, but managed to keep his balance. The fight continued with Jake using his speed and mobility to stay away from Mordak's most dangerous attacks. The champion was incredibly strong, but he was also getting tired from swinging his heavy arms and chasing his elusive opponent around the arena. Jake, on the other hand, was breathing steadily and conserving his energy for the right moment. Human beings had better cardiovascular systems than most alien species. Jake could maintain his current pace for much longer than Mordak could sustain his all-out assault. The champion was beginning to breathe heavily, and his movements were becoming slightly slower and less coordinated. Jake noticed that Mordak was favoring his left side, where several of Jake's earlier strikes had landed. The champion was trying to hide his discomfort, but Jake could see the subtle signs of pain and fatigue. This was Jake's chance to take control of the fight before the champion could recover his strength. The human feinted to the left, then quickly moved right as Mordak committed to blocking the fake attack. Jake slipped behind the champion and jumped up to wrap his arms around Mordak's thick neck. This was a dangerous move because it put Jake within reach of the champion's claws, but it was also his best chance to end the fight. Jake locked his arms in a sleeper hold that he had learned during military training. The technique cut off blood flow to the brain rather than cutting off air to the lungs. If applied correctly, it would cause unconsciousness within seconds without permanent damage. Jake squeezed with all his strength, while Mordak thrashed wildly, trying to dislodge him. The champion grabbed at Jake's arms and tried to pull him loose, but the human had locked his grip too tightly. Mordak spun in circles and even threw himself backward against the arena wall, trying to crush Jake against the stone. Jake held on grimly despite the pain from being slammed into the hard surface. Mordak's movements became weaker and more uncoordinated as the blood flow to his brain was restricted. The mighty champion, who had never lost a fight, was losing consciousness in front of hundreds of witnesses. His legs began to buckle, and he dropped to one knee, while still trying desperately to break free. The arena was completely silent, except for the sound of Mordak's labored breathing and his claws scraping against the stone floor. No one could believe what they were seeing. Their invincible champion was being defeated by a creature they had dismissed as weak and pathetic. Mordak made one final desperate attempt to break Jake's hold. He grabbed the human's arm with both hands and tried to pull it away from his neck. For a moment, it seemed like his superior strength might be enough to escape the hold. But Jake adjusted his grip and squeezed even tighter, cutting off the last bit of blood flow. The champion's eyes rolled back in his head, and his massive body went limp. Mordak collapsed face first onto the arena floor with Jake still clinging to his neck. The human held the chokehold for several more seconds to make sure the champion was completely unconscious before finally releasing his grip. Jake rolled away from Mordak's motionless form and struggled to his feet. His whole body ached from the punishment he had taken during the fight, but he was alive and victorious. The human stood over his fallen opponent, breathing heavily but triumphant. The silence in the arena stretched on for what felt like hours. No one seemed able to process what had just happened. Mordak, the Unbreakable, had been broken by a human who was barely half his size. Everything the Cathari believed about strength and weakness had just been turned upside down. Jake stood in the center of the arena, breathing heavily while sweat and blood dripped from his battered body. Around him, hundreds of Cathari stared in complete silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Their mighty champion lay, unconscious at Jake's feet, proving that everything they believed about strength and weakness was wrong. Mordak began to stir after several minutes of unconsciousness. The massive champion rolled over slowly and pushed himself up to his hands and knees. His yellow eyes were unfocused and confused as he tried to remember what had happened. When he saw Jake standing over him, the memory of his defeat came flooding back. The champion looked up at Jake with an expression that mixed shock with something that might have been respect. Mordak had never been defeated in combat before, and he was struggling to understand how a creature he had dismissed as weak could have overpowered him. The human had used techniques and strategies that were completely foreign to Cathari fighting methods. "I submit," Mordak said quietly, but his words carried clearly in the silent arena. According to the ancient laws of ritual combat, Jake had won the right to kill his defeated opponent. Every Cathari expected the human to deliver a finishing blow to prove his dominance over the former champion. Jake looked down at Mordak and felt no desire for revenge or further violence. The fight was over, and he had proven his point about human capabilities. Killing the champion would serve no purpose except to satisfy the bloodthirsty expectations of the watching crowd. Jake had been raised to show mercy to defeated enemies. "The fight is finished," Jake announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I have no wish to kill a defeated opponent. Mordak fought with honor and he deserves to live." Jake extended his hand to help the former champion to his feet. This gesture of mercy shocked the Cathari even more than his victory had. War Chief Zraktar climbed down from his viewing box and approached the two fighters. His expression showed amazement and growing respect as he studied Jake with new eyes. By defeating their champion, according to the sacred laws of combat, Jake had earned a position of high status in Cathari society. "You have won more than a fight today," Zraktar said formally. "You have won the respect of our people and a place of honor in our settlement. We were wrong to call you weak and to treat you as a curiosity. You have shown us that strength comes in many forms that we did not understand." The crowd began to cheer as the implications of Jake's victory sank in. The human had not only defeated their champion, but had done so using intelligence and technique rather than brute force. This opened up entirely new ways of thinking about combat and survival that the Cathari had never considered before. Elder Vexisha made her way slowly to the arena floor with the help of a walking stick. The ancient historian had watched thousands of combat rituals during her long life, but she had never seen anything like what Jake had accomplished. Her old eyes sparkled with curiosity and newfound respect. "I must record everything about this fight," Vexisha said as she approached Jake. "Our people need to understand that we have been blind to the true nature of strength. You have taught us that intelligence and skill can overcome raw power when properly applied. This knowledge will change our society forever." Jake helped Mordak to his feet and was surprised when the former champion clasped his shoulder in a gesture of respect. The massive alien had been humbled by his defeat, but he seemed genuinely impressed by Jake's fighting techniques. Mordak asked if Jake would be willing to teach him some of the methods that had led to his victory. Other young Cathari warriors began gathering around Jake with similar requests. They wanted to learn about human combat techniques and the strategies that had allowed such a small fighter to defeat their greatest champion. Jake realized that his victory had opened the door to cultural exchange between their species. Jake agreed to share his knowledge with any Cathari who were interested in learning. He explained the concepts of leverage and pressure points and how human fighters used speed and endurance to overcome stronger opponents. The aliens listened with fascination as Jake described human martial arts and military training methods. In return, the Cathari began teaching Jake about their own fighting techniques and training methods. They showed him how to build physical strength and endurance using methods that were adapted to his smaller human frame. Jake learned about their weapons and armor crafting skills that could be useful for human space explorers. War Chief Zrak-Tar declared that Jake would be given a permanent place of honor in their settlement with all the rights and privileges of a high-status warrior. The human would no longer be treated as a curiosity or prisoner, but as a respected member of their community who had proven his worth through combat. Jake used his new status to establish protocols for peaceful contact between humans and Cathari. He explained that other humans would eventually come looking for him, and that first contact should be handled carefully to avoid misunderstandings. The aliens were eager to meet more humans now that they understood the true capabilities of Jake's species. Elder Vexashaw began working with Jake to create a comprehensive record of human culture and capabilities. She wanted to ensure that future generations of Cathari would understand that physical appearance could be deceiving and that different species had different evolutionary advantages that made them formidable in their own ways. Jake established a training program where young Cathari could learn human fighting techniques while teaching humans about Cathari strength training and combat skills. This exchange of knowledge benefited both species and created bonds of friendship that would last for generations. The story of Jake's victory spread quickly to other Cathari settlements, and soon representatives from distant communities were arriving to meet the human who had defeated Mordak the Umbrae.